home girls. I've been so excited about Khali's talk. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Khali. Thank you for that talk. So now I'm going to hand over to Faustin.
Yeah, and I'm happy to introduce our next talk about observability for CI/CD with Nočnica. I hope I got it right.
Oh, you did it just right, Thorsten.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
So the stage is yours.
All right, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can see the presentation. If I could just get a thumbs up or, oh, hey, it looks great. Fantastic. Okay, so the sort of this talk is, as you see, without observability, CI/CD doesn't work. Love to have an interpreter here. We should be a pretty straightforward talk. I sometimes get to talking a little bit rapidly, but we'll do our best. We'll all try to muddle through. Let me just start a timer though, because we don't want to realize that we've taken 45 minutes when we did not mean to. Okay, so a little bit about myself. My name is Nočnica. Nika is fine if you have trouble pronouncing Nočnica, but I will make fun of you. I work at New Relic. I am a dev advocate specializing in serverless and cloud engineering. You can find me on Twitter at serverlessmom and on Twitch at serverlessmom, where I do try to mainly talk about serverless and other fun things like that. Okay, we've got a little bit of audio echo. So Arthur, if you could maybe just turn down your speaker just a little bit. And I hope we're working great, but I think, oh, great. We're in very good shape on my side. So hopefully we're in good shape. Okay, so how do we begin? A horror story called DevOps. We all have these incidents, these responses that just don't go as well as we planned. So in my case, one day I was trying to go out for a hike in the park here in Portland, which is the largest urban park inside an urban center in Portland. And what I got was a page saying, hey, nobody knows why, but we think maybe Redis is not working correctly. And this, of course, didn't start there. It started with, we had a salesperson who was presenting material, of course, in a demo, of course, for one of our enterprise customers, and the product was not working as we expected. So everybody had their own theory, and I know this is a dense slide, but I'm actually going to read it because it really is a pretty good synopsis of what we saw in our Slack chat for the incident, right? We said, well, throughput is the same. The number of requests coming through is the same, but maybe our DB queries are getting beefier. They're taking longer. Let's ask a DBA or database administrator to take a look. Somebody else replied, hey, you know what? I don't think the problem is even on the back end. I think that maybe it's just a front end issue. It's sending requests that's not coming through. Since we don't see the error rate, let's have the front end team come and take a look, right? And then, of course, you get to these two classic questions, which are, well, maybe the problem is just local to our network. Maybe the salesperson was signed into our VPN. Can somebody switch off the Wi-Fi on their phone, try it from a mobile network, and see if it works? And then somebody else comes back and says, hey, maybe it's our geo. Let's go ahead and wake up the Dublin team, and they'll take a look. And I think we all have been here, right? We've all been at this point where this is pretty painful, where now everybody's involved, everybody's in a text chat, and it's just really hard to nail down what's going on. And even if the problem resolves fairly easily, at this point, we've had 10, 20 people disrupted to be able to get to the bottom of an issue. So one thing that's really important to note here is that during an incident, it's really the timeline that is critical. So if we can establish that one component is earlier than the others, that really helps us understand that it probably has a causal relationship with the other components. And one request for our organizer, if there's an event chat, and I do not have a link to it. So if they wanted to drop that into the StreamYard chat, I would just super duper appreciate that. But because I can't see if you're sending questions in chat, but I promise I will try to get to them by the end of the presentation. So during an incident, it's really that timeline that matters. Now, when we go to chop up an error like that, there are these components we'd really like to answer almost every time, right? When we have a mysterious problem. And usually I think of them in something like, I'd like to know these 4 pieces. I'd like to know the error rates on each component, right? When we say, hey, we're seeing errors in the front end, okay, well, are we getting them within our application layer? Is the data layer seeing them? The throughput on the back end would be my next question. And when I say back end, I'm trying to go as far back as I can, right? So if I can say, hey, here's the throughput on the database layer, if I say, hey, the database layer suddenly lost all of its requests, that's a really strong indicator. Next, I'd like to say, hey, did we change our permissions and configuration? And finally, and this is the topic that really we're thinking about, is what's the deployment history? Did some piece of the code or infrastructure change today, right, recently? Now, we would expect that our use of infrastructure of code should have made this quite a bit easier, right? Because where previously these 4 pieces might be missing the fact that we had reconfigured something, had maybe reduced the provisioned resources to one service, or changed routing, we would hope that if we're using infrastructure as code, we're able to see really readily that piece has changed. But I would submit that even though when using infrastructure as code, it's possible to see that something did change at a particular time and probably correlate it out to say, hey, this happened relatively earlier. Also, once everyone is awake, in general, you do get somebody saying, oh, we did change, we did deploy this code change recently. But there are really 2 barriers to that as a complete understanding. The first is that hopefully we are moving towards an extremely, continuous deployment world where it's really not that notable that we released some code. So on the human side, it may well not be that the team lead or incident response person from a team knows for sure that no code has changed. And then secondarily, I would submit, this is a slide that shows up in every one of my presentations wherever I go. The speed with which we can read a dashboard has a direct effect on our observability. So, it may be that a code change is findable somewhere as a repository commit, but that doesn't mean that we can do it quickly. And so we still have everybody woken up and everybody pinged to try and figure out what's going on before we say, oh, right, this piece changed beforehand. This is a Prometheus, a Grafana dashboard on a Prometheus database. And I show it here. Obviously, we're not going to read any of this tiny, tiny writing, but I do say, hey, you can look at this and you can start to have a theory right away about what is the cause of our problem. And I really, really like that piece. And in the end, this sort of results in a pretty difficult mindset, right? We get to this point where even after the thing is resolved, we're like, I don't want to deploy on Fridays. I don't want to deploy, to these components. I want to limit people's ability to release things. It's just something we're like, boy, this is tough. It's tough to support. So I've talked a couple times about observability, and I'm going to take just a minute to say, hey, what is observability really? Because, is it just a marketing buzzword? It's a very common term specifically on the West Coast of the United States, but it's not necessarily used everywhere else. So I think of observability as being the speed with which we can understand a problem. So, this is a pretty low-res picture, but if you take a look at it for a minute, you can pretty quickly say, oops, there is a problem here. We are having a problem, right? And ideally, we want to go from knowing that we have a problem to understanding what we might do next pretty quickly. And that is all that observability is the time it takes us to do that. So we can have situations that have almost no observability, like if we know that we have a problem with sort of a classic, maybe self-hosted or virtual server, and we say, oh, it gets in some weird state, it stops working in this specific way, and then you just restart it. And so in that case, we're able to fix a problem, but we don't understand it at all. So we sort of have like no observability. And so for most of us, the observability question, the question of how quickly we can understand a problem, is a lot more about stress than it is about a particular engineering goal. So increased observability will not de facto mean that you deliver more nines or more uptime or that you deliver faster performance, but it does mean that every single failure will get resolved with a lot less stress if you have more observability. Now, once you resolve that stress, you hopefully get to a point where you can say, okay, not only do I understand these incidents, but also I can see how we're going to move forward from this and how we're going to handle some problems before they become large enough to really affect us. I keep my goals for observability on a team kind of low. I say my goal is that when a salesperson gets in touch and says, hey, this component isn't working, I'm trying it out on my way into a demo, you can say, hey, we actually knew about this 10 minutes ago and it's almost resolved now. It's not that you're never going to have a problem that somehow affects, your service, but the fact is that you want to hopefully detect it a little sooner than just having it be something that an end user is telling you about for the first time. Okay. So how do we get to this point? How do we get to this point of having real observability of our complete stack? It's not the most, it can seem when we first think about it like a pretty long road to get to a stack where we can sit down, say, hey, we have some sort of problem, and be able to say in a few minutes what we sort of suspect very strongly is the cause, and also what our next steps are. If we can get to a point where we can feel like we know that within a few minutes, then we're starting to feel like we have real control over our stack. And if you're at a point where you're maybe going in and just kind of manually looking at recent permissions changes or going and snooping through everybody's commits to a repository, it can feel like, oh my gosh, this is just, we're really, really far away from that. In general, we would say that there are 3 components we want to have for a well-measured system. And this can help us kind of break down what we need to do into smaller and smaller pieces. So the first, this is a quote from Kandinsky, everything starts from a dot. This is 3 Pillars by Kandinsky. Come on, I got to tie this together a little bit. And this is the concept that one of the pillars of observability is just a dot. It is an XY coordinate. That one of the pillars of observability is knowing metrics, right? Metrics are the most dense and densely transmitted of the observability pieces. A very tiny packet of information can contain all that we need to know about performance, about low throughput. It's the kind of stuff we get generally out of the box, any place in AWS, right? That we're getting some kind of metrics that show us what's going on in a component. And so when we ask things like, what is the throughput on each component, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, we have metrics that will give us that right away. So the next piece is logs. And the thing about logs is there's always a lot of logs, right? Logs can be anything. They're very often human readable text components that give us some kind of detail about something that's going on and may or may not have been sort of human designed, or maybe there is the result of some library that we're using or some other component. Logs always have the answer to what's going on. If observability was just, is the answer somewhere, then once you're doing enough logging, you'd say, oh, well, we for sure know the answer somewhere. And the problem with logging sort of like if you're just using it naively and just say, hey, I'm just going to add a bunch of log statements all over my code, I'm going to store those logs, and that means I have observability, is that logs can often get us in a situation where we get back some information, but it is not the information that we were expecting. So in this case, this is a classic story that Diogenes of Sinope asks Plato to say, you can't define anything. You cannot absolutely prove anything to me. He says, Plato, just tell me what is a man? Tell me what a man is. And Plato thinks about it for a minute. He says, oh, it's easy. A man has no fur on his body, and he walks around on 2 legs, and that's a man. And I just did it in 2 sentences, so I can define anything very easily. And Diogenes says, look, I've brought you a man. So with logging, this is the very real problem that we have with logging. When we say, oh, I want to go in and get some information from logs, we'll get a lot of results that may not be exactly what we're looking for. The last piece of observability is tracing, and tracing is about detailed performance monitoring. And so we're not going to talk about it here, frankly. It doesn't make a ton of sense for this issue. When we're talking about a failure or an error, tracing is usually not going to help us. Tracing is things like storing the time spans that every act takes, and also how those requests are connected. And for that piece, you could say that tracing is useful. So something like AWS X-Ray is useful, but it's not part of this talk. I just want to say it's the third pillar. So we'll move on from there. So let's talk about a brief history of the concept of tracking deployments and other code changes in a way that is usable and quickly readable. So I worked for New Relic, and back in the day, when New Relic first had a concept of tracking deployments, let's talk about how we did it at the outset. So early on, this is a mock-up that I made because this interface is no longer active on New Relic, but it's still a pretty good representation of what it looked like. When we first thought, hey, we want people to track deployments along with metrics, we tried implementing an API endpoint to say, hey, there was a deployment on this application or this entity. And it was like a specialized event database that said, give us a time that the deployment happened, give us what entity it happened to, and then a short string that explains what happened. So if you would hover over this indicator line, it would give you some sentence about what had happened. And so, this at first was a pretty good, initial implementation of that concept. So it would show up on graphs everywhere for that entity, and you could hover over and get a little data. Now, implicitly, this was a bit limited, right? Because you had to design a system that when you were deploying code was always sending out something to our API endpoint. And since this was back in like 2010 or 2012, there wasn't the ability necessarily to automatically connect, every single deploy to a deployment indicator. And the other piece was being tied to a single entity, trying to tie down, hey, this change happened to this application, was a totally reasonable concept when we were deep in the virtual machine world, but it wasn't necessarily as reasonable once you're having like whole swarms of microservices that may have interdependencies and so may very actively be affected by changes that have happened to other services. We did, however, find a really interesting corollary once we did any kind of deployment indicators at all, which is that while we thought of it as being an incident response tool to say, hey, we're suddenly down, we suddenly have no throughput on a particular service, we instead saw that a very common use for it was when kind of metrics had just shifted a little bit. So, a classic example is something like this. I was worried our ads weren't working. Turns out the last deploy broke our analytics. So instead of a marketing team running around and saying, oh my gosh, our AdWords are suddenly ineffective, or we need to spend more money over here, we said, oh, we just deployed something to the front end, and suddenly our throughput here dropped. It must be that we deployed something that broke our metrics. And so, this very effectively showed us that the value of seeing when deployments happened stretched a lot further than just responding to single alerts and more into a deep understanding of how our system was working. So with the CDK and in a larger cloud environment, logs are very often the way to go and build that kind of real insight. So rather than using like a specialized event database that is just for logging, just for storing deploy information, which is more of a specialized case, logging absolutely is the way to get the kind of deep information we actually want about what's changing on deploy. Now, we're almost out of time, and I'm not going to presume to exactly instruct us in how we're going to make these connections for our team. There absolutely are great tools out there, and I'm going to talk about a few of the sort of general ideas for moving to a space where deployments and other code changes are more observable by your whole team. So here's a few that I think are really, really key. So one is, and I apologize, the text is just a little bit small, but I'm going to read through all four of these, is one is to have CloudWatch emitting signals when we have a log matching a pattern. So rather than going through and trying to find patterns ourselves, if you do the time do the legwork ahead of time to say, hey, CloudWatch, when you see a log event like a log line like this, go ahead and emit a signal. This is a really effective way to get your team a little more synchronized about what we're expecting to see and what we'd like to see every time we do have a change. Now, the next one is to use the AWS logs module with the CDK. So some kind of standardization and training across your team is a very effective way to make sure that new resources are logging correctly and showing new events. And then obviously we want to try to connect every CI/CD path to logging. So this is something that we want to discuss with our team. And again, something that you'll see is kind of a common theme here is that a lot of these are actually just cultural changes within your team rather than being changes that have to happen to be able to that happen on a technical level to sort of force those changes throughout. It's less about adopting a certain library than adopting a practice within your team. And then the last one, and this is a very standard piece of AWS advice, but it doesn't mean it's not great, is to use some form of structured logging. So the more that you can log objects that reflect state a little more clearly, the more likely you are to be able to look in later and be able to parse and use that log correctly. And CDK even has options for logging things like tables and stuff that can be really effective. So that's been my time, folks. I know I do, I'm sure, have a link in my email to the event chat, and so that's where I'll be hopping over to in just a moment. But again, I'm Nočnica. Nika's fine if you can't pronounce Nočnica. And I am on Twitter at serverlessmom and on Twitch at serverlessmom, where right now what we're doing is building a computer from scratch on a breadboard. Which has been a fun project for the last couple of weeks. I think we have our next speaker ready to go. Hey, Eric.
Hey, how are you? Nočnica.
You got it. You got it.
Hey, just FYI, we did add the link for the chat, so you probably have some questions going on there. We added it quite a bit earlier. So yeah, if you and just so y'all know, if you need that link, and I'll say it verbally, it's at cdkday.com/watch, and it's got all the links to the CDK dev, the Wonder Me, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I also see that there was also like a tab on this thing that I missed, and I've got the comments now, so now I feel super rude.
There'll be a lashing later, and we'll have it out. But no, you're good. Everything's good, and great talk on observability. I'm a huge fan of observability. I'm not, and I'm passionate about it, and I love that you talked about it. So thank you.
So I do. If it's okay, we got a couple minutes. So you mind if I answer the questions that are in the comments?
Please
First
do.
of all,
Please do.
Yes, this does say jiaozi or dumplings because I love dumplings. So I'm glad to have neon that says so. When I saw this piece of neon for sale, and there was some of the Mandarin that I could actually read, I love it. Yeah, and thank you so much for the replies. I really appreciate it. I know some people have seen me streaming on Twitch and seeing some of the captured streams on YouTube, which I love. And then what was the name of the drawing at the beginning? What was the name of the drawing at the beginning? What was the name? Three Pillars by Kandinsky. That's the actual piece of art that I had. And then this is a book plate from the Shakespeare project. That there was this illustrated Shakespeare that was released in about 1850, and there's a project with some university to release it. If you go and Google like Shakespeare plate public domain, you'll find them all. And so I love it because it's illustrations of Shakespearean scenes in kind of like 1840s, like components. The one about Plato. Oh yeah, that's just I don't know. That's just Diogenes of Sinope. I absolutely love talking about Diogenes quotes. But yeah, no, the Plato one. I didn't have a picture of Plato. But this here is Three Pillars by Kandinsky.
There's a question from Kyle Roach on here, Nikon. Any advice on how to use along with CloudWatch logs metrics?
Yeah, so you absolutely need to have some solution that integrates CloudWatch metrics and CloudWatch logs. So there are a ton of ways to do that. New Relic is one of many that will import CloudWatch logs as necessary and will also, of course, access CloudWatch metrics. There's a CloudWatch API to grab those components out really effectively. So, I would generally say for most, modern cloud architectures, you want to be using as your logging path. You want to be logging out to CloudWatch and then processing those logs separately. So it's great to use some kind of subscription filter to make sure you're not sending absolutely everything as these huge data outs. But you do want to use CloudWatch as your endpoint, because especially serverless is my whole bailiwick. So that's what I want to talk about. Any other way that you would sort of just code up on your own, you're going to end up adding to your Lambda's runtime and other components, and you're not going to be that happy with that. But if you try to send even a very beefy object out to your CloudWatch logs, that goes just like that. So if you're like, I don't want to use CloudWatch, then you want to look into the extensions API, which is definitely an advanced, Lambda engineers tool, which, our team uses it, but boy, oh boy, that one feels a little tough to do. What's really nice is to use tools like New Relic, and there's a really great version of it from Honeycomb, and I know Lightstep has a really good version of it, to actually process your logs out into the metrics that you might be getting out. And so telling you things like the rate that something is occurring within your logs, and that's a really great way to get high cardinality data out without just resorting to sort of chewing everything down and processing it into more readable metrics. Really, really good question.
We had a follow-up to that. Is there still benefit in using Grafana for applications on AWS?
Yeah, fantastic. So the thing to really keep in mind is that by default, CloudWatch is, don't get mad at me, Eric. I know you.
I like that you said serverless is your bailiwick. We're good.
By default, right? For example, with serverless, CloudWatch is going to give you metrics related to building and high-level performance. So using a tool like Grafana is going to make a ton of sense if you are sending some metrics that go a little bit deeper than that into a kind of application insight that obviously you're not going to get by default from CloudWatch, right? So something like, hey, what was the slowest method within my code is just not something that by design, it's not something that AWS is trying to give you insight with out of the box. So if you use something like an OpenTelemetry package, or you use a New Relic agent, or you use one of the several other products that help you do that level of function insight, it's really great to be using Grafana libraries to chart that stuff. So what's nice now is that there's a totally open source ways to do this. And so I really, really love people who are using OpenTelemetry packages to send trace data and other performance data, talking about one of those pillars, right, which is tracing. And to be able to send that data up to something like a Prometheus DB and then chart it with Grafana is fantastic.
I'm going to surprise you here, but I would tell you that, CloudWatch, those kind of tools, they give you the ability to build a lot of the stuff. They're incredibly powerful. Yeah. But out of the box, you're right. Out of the box, you're not going to, some of the stuff you're not going to immediately get. And that's why we love our partners. That's why we love a New Relic and something like that, where they're building these common desktop or dashboards that grab that for you out of the box. So
yeah. And if someone told me, hey, when you go to use this platform, it installs something like the New Relic agent, I would be like, nah, I don't want that. What happened to the shared responsibility model that says, hey, I don't want you necessarily keeping track of every function call that I make, right? What if one of my function calls is called, this /username/location, right? I don't want you just throwing that up on a dashboard by default, right? We want to use something like a partner product in an intentional way to say, hey, this is one of the ones we want this deep insight into, because it introduces other problems, and again, it sort of muddies the shared responsibility model. Okay, that I think is my time though, so I think we got to let our next speaker up. I know, Eric, you're the one in charge of it, but
yeah, nobody lets me be in charge, but I do have buttons I can push. So, all right, Thorsten, I'm going to turn it over to you, and here you go.
Yeah, and I will introduce some fantastic people from Liberty Mutual talking about how they scale CDK in their company.
All righty. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share that out. We're also switching out our interpreter. So Norma, you are up. I want to just take a moment and give a shout out to our interpreters, Norma, Arthur, Nicole, and Kim. You guys have been fantastic, and I appreciate it, and thank you. And Norma, you're on screen. Are you ready? All righty, here we go. I'm going to take Arthur off, and then we'll start the video. Nika, thanks again. I appreciate it. Oop. I removed before response.